From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Next is Jessie Daniels, professor of sociology at Hunter College. She studies race and digital media technologies, and she is going to share a story about how some library collections can be manipulated by hate groups online with her presentation, Extremists in the Archive. Jessie.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm here today to talk to you about extremists in the archive. And part of what my research has led me to believe is that you can't understand the world in which we live today without understanding white supremacy. And by that I mean both the system of ideas that sets white people above all others, and also the extremist groups that I've encountered in some of my research in the archive. The first thing that I want to share with you is this slide. This is from an extremist website that I found that was called American Civil Rights Review. And I actually came upon it because it was discovered by a college student of mine where I taught in suburban Long Island at the time. This was in 2008. And part of what this website was arguing through a white supremacist lens was that slavery was not that bad. And they were using Library of Congress material, a digital archive of the WPA project that interviewed formerly enslaved people to make that argument. So I want to talk about some of the unintended consequences of digitizing archives, and I want to tell the story of how I discovered this website and how we got to here. So I want to tell you a little bit about my research. In the 90s, I started, actually in the late 80s, but I started publishing in 1997 some research I had done on a printed archive of newsletters from 6 different extremist organizations, including the KKK and actually David Duke's organization, a bunch of different ones. And to do this research, this was my dissertation and then became my first book. To do this research, I had to travel. I drove 7 hours from where I was in school at Austin, Texas, to Montgomery, Alabama, where the Southern Poverty Law Center keeps what they call a Klan Watch archive. They keep a trove of these printed newsletters of these extremist groups. And I drove there and stood over a copy machine for 3 or 4 days, and through their generosity, developed my archive for that first publication. In that research, what I argued was that white supremacist rhetoric is gendered, and by that I mean that the things that they say about race often have some other message about masculinity or femininity in them. I was particularly fascinated by the way that they talked about white men, and I'll say more about that in 1 second. The second argument I made, which I think is relevant today, is that white supremacist rhetoric is similar to mainstream political and popular culture rhetoric. So looking at those extremist publications, I compare them to the mainstream rhetoric at the time of politicians like Pat Buchanan and Bill Clinton, to be completely bipartisan about it, and also looked at popular culture themes, and there was a lot of resonance between the two. So I argued that they were similar in some ways. And then about the gendered argument, it sort of came together with the argument that they're similar to the mainstream in an image like this. So not only did I look at the text, I also looked at the images and line drawings in these white supremacist publications. This one is from Tom Metzger's White Aryan Resistance publication. And what you see here is a line drawing of a white man. He's wearing a baseball cap. I don't know that it's red, but he has on a construction vest, and in the background are bridges and cities and an airplane. The message here is that white men built this nation, white men are this nation. And my argument about the mainstream, you can see in a more recent example from, this is the History Channel, right? They're doing a series on the men who built America. The American economy was linked by railroads, fueled by oil and built by steel, right? The same kind of rhetoric that, and my argument about white supremacy is that it erases and ignores the labor of people of color, of Native Americans who were in this land before. So that's the work that I did early on. Right. Then the internet happened. Now, I know for those of you sitting in this session, you know that the internet happened well before 1997, but it was really starting to take off in higher ed, and I started using the internet in my classes and teaching with it. I also began wondering, how was the internet changing white supremacy? I kept following those same groups that I looked at and analyzed in the printed publication, and I wanted to know how it was changing those groups. So I started work on the second book called Cyber Racism, and part of what I found is that instead of having to drive 7 hours to the Southern Poverty Law Center archive, the white supremacist rhetoric that I had studied before was now much easier to access, right? I could find it in my living room and dial it up that way. It was also global, so that people were making connections across the globe around white supremacy, and it was more participatory. People were contributing their own takes on it. But the point is, it made my research much easier, and it also made it easier for these groups to connect. So this is one of the places that I studied in the cyber racism book. This is Stormfront. You may have heard of it. It's the longest-running white supremacist portal online, and I spent lots of hours there, so you don't have to. When I finished research for the book in 2008, they had about 129,000 registered users. When I checked last week, they're at 325,683, and that number only goes up, or it has so far since I've been researching it. On the night President Obama was elected in 2008, so many people went to Stormfront that they crashed the servers there. So I was concerned about the extremist groups, but I was concerned about my students. I was teaching that at the time in a suburban private university on Long Island, and I was concerned about how they were going to stumble upon white supremacist rhetoric online just in their course of doing research for their term papers and that sort of thing. So I want to tell this one story about taking my students on Long Island into a computer lab. This is in the early 90s. It was before Google even. That'll tell you how long ago it was. And so we were using different kinds of search engines, Yahoo, Alta Vista, what's another one? Anyway, lots of different search engines that have gone by the wayside now. I had two students come in, and one student typed, the first thing that student typed in was kkk.com into a search engine. And the next student, another student in that same class, typed in Martin Luther King into a search engine. They both ended up at white supremacist sites. And I said, that's really what I'm interested in this work, is understanding my students' search patterns and how they might stumble upon white supremacist rhetoric. Now, this is one of the sites this is the site that my student came upon, and how I found it was through them. This is what I refer to. It appears to be a tribute to Dr. King, but in fact, it's run by Stormfront, that large portal that I showed you just previously. So this is what I came to call a cloaked website. Like the one I started the presentation with that was talking about slavery, what both of these sites and lots of others that I could tell you about later do is that they intentionally disguise authorship in order to conceal a political agenda. Right? In some ways, these cloaked websites were precursors to today's news. Part of what makes them difficult to decipher is it's not clear who is publishing them and what their point of view is. So this was especially difficult for my students in college classes. Even though we were talking about some of these issues already, they struggled to make sense of them. So this is what I decided to do in terms of my research, is I would ask young people, actually younger than college students, so I recruited participants who were 15 to 19 years old, all from New York, all from fairly good high schools, and asked them to try and make sense of these search results. Like if they searched for information on Dr. King and they came across this site, how would they make sense of it? And then I also asked them to evaluate pairs of websites. So I would pair a cloaked site with a legitimate civil rights organization site. So this is a pairing here of the Martin Luther King cloaked site, and then the site from the King family and their archive of King's papers and that sort of thing. And then the second pairing I did was actually a Library of Congress site. I paired that cloaked site, the American Civil Rights Review, that has the slavery information from WPA, with the Voices of Civil Rights, which was created and hosted here at the Library of Congress, and asked young people, so how would you make sense of this? So what I found was interesting in terms of their understanding of this material and how they made sense of information from the archive. The first thing, and this is the bright spot and the encouraging part of my talk, which is that they were very savvy. Even in 2007, 2008, when I was doing this analysis, they were very savvy about the way that websites looked, right? They picked up on graphic user interface, they picked up on colors that were not good, and on fonts that were not clear or didn't look sophisticated. This one young person said the site looks like someone, just an individual created it. It doesn't look very professional. So she said she wouldn't trust it, wouldn't trust the information there, right? So the good news is that they're very sophisticated about the look of sites. The bad news, as we know now, is that all it takes really is a much better graphic designer to fool someone with information. So the other thing that I asked them about was the content of the site. So beyond the look of the site, how do you evaluate the content that you're looking at there? And this is a page further into that one about slavery. And what's interesting, what I wanted to point out here is that part of what this white supremacist, Joe Weltner, had done was to Frank Weltner, what he had done was he had taken this language of multiculturalism, of forgotten black voices, and then taken the WPA quotes of formerly enslaved people who would say things like, yes, we were allowed to grow vegetables when we were enslaved, and takes those out of context and reframes them in a white supremacist context, right? For some of the young people I talked to, this was very hard to make sense of, and this is some of what they said. One young person said, looking at this site I just showed you, I don't think I would disagree with it. I'm sure there are some slaves that were treated well, so I can understand their point of view. There's always two sides to everything. Now, as an educator, this is a little horrifying, and I'm sure some of you share that as well. One of the other participants I talked to read this material and said, I don't know about this because I've read other things about slavery, and I know that this isn't true, right? So she was able, through a kind of, what I would call a burgeoning critical race consciousness, to make sense of this site through other things that she had read outside the context of that one site. So in conclusion, I just want to say this. So my research really sits kind of by accident, in a way, on either side of the internet, right? This analysis in the printed-only newsletters of white supremacists, and then in the internet era of their work. And what I can tell you is that whether in a printed archive at the Southern Poverty Law Center or in a digital archive at the Library of Congress, the goal of white supremacy is the same. Both before and after the internet. And that is to roll back hard-won social, legal, political, and moral victories. And what we know is that the internet and digital archives, unfortunately, make this even easier. Thanks very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.